People don't understand that disability people, they have to live in places that are very, very dangerous. Nobody should have to live like that.
Bethesda Cornerstone Village in Victoria is the first in the country where we're actually integrating people that are age 55 years and older with people with intellectual developmental disabilities. Not only are we inclusive, but we have activities and programming that bring both populations together in one setting that creates that community, which is so critical and so important.
Bethesda has group homes all over the United States. What we've found is that the government has changed the way that they're funding group homes and individuals with disabilities. Bethesda had to come up with a new plan on how they can come up with funding for their people with disabilities.
Here in Bethesda Cornerstone Village in Victoria, 20% of the units are set aside for individuals with an intellectual developmental disability. And those individuals really are receiving rent subsidies equivalent to 50% of the county median income. We provide subsidies through other sources, such as help from real estate tax abatement from the City of Victoria. And then we have a philanthropy department that also provides help and assistance to these individuals. Cornerstone Village, in our transformation, really takes it to the next step.
It is really important that we have a strong community here. So one of my main jobs is to create this community, create activities and events and classes for all of the residents. All of our activities are for everybody here at Cornerstone. This way we can integrate the seniors with the people with disabilities.
What that does is that really lifts people up that have a disability to be as independent as possible. And that's the goal. Independence is really quality of life. Bethesda Lutheran Communities is a recognized service organization within the LCMS, as well as LCEF. We've really cultivated and thought of different ways of how LCEF could be a part of this initiative. And one of the ways is to participate in providing us financing for this development. The core values of LCEF and Bethesda are identical. We all are here serving the kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus. When you have that common value, the opportunities are limitless. Bethesda Cornerstone Village in Victoria here is our first housing community that we've created, but it's certainly not the last.
I think we joked one time that wouldn't it be great if when it was done, Kurth could live here? It'd just be like a dream of mine. And here I am, living at Cornerstone Village. It's just the most amazing thing I've ever experienced.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our LCEF webinar. My name is Rahema Kavuga, and I serve as the Director of Synod Relations for Lutheran Church Extension Fund. We are so excited to partner with the LCMS RSO office to offer this two-part webinar series on board governance. Last week, we heard from Kurth and this week, we're really excited to have a panel of CEOs for some RSOs, as well as an LCEF resource here to discuss more of what it's like to actually be in the boardroom and how to work through maybe some of the issues and the rewarding aspects of a board. So before we begin, I'd like to remind you of a couple of things during the webinar. You are muted through the entire thing, but you are more than welcome, especially during this interactive panel discussion, to put any comments or questions in the chat feature. We'll be able to address as many of those as we can during this time. This webinar is being recorded and will be released later this week along with part 1 from last week. So watch your email and you will receive those links for both of the webinars. Again, we're so excited for this partnership with the LCMS RSO office, and Dorothy Kranz has also joined that. So if you have a direct question for Dorothy, she'll be more than happy to answer those. I was talking with our speakers, and I know there's a few RSOs listening that are waiting for their RSO status. So Dorothy, make sure you're nice to them, okay? At this time, I'd like to introduce our three speakers. Our first speaker is Angie Mullering. She's the president and CEO of Lutheran Social Services of Indiana. During her 30 years of social service experience, Angie's work has been focused on families through innovative program development and the stewardship of resources in an effort to improve systems and drive greater impact. Angie has led LSSI since 2011. In 2013, she initiated strategy work that resulted in LSSI's impact statement that focuses its efforts on promoting the overall health of our community by equipping willing families facing the most challenging obstacles with the skills necessary to make the positive life choices as evidenced by advancement toward economic and family stability. Throughout her tenure, her priorities have included building systems that address client need and bridge service gaps in the community, collaborating with community organizations to address complex social challenges and establish outcome measures that align programs for deeper impact. Angie is engaged in the community through her service in the Allen County Judicial Nominating Committee since 2013, and she is a founding board member of the Alliance for Human Services, a coalition working to engage Northeast Indiana nonprofit organizations through idea sharing, collaboration, and peer-to-peer networking to build stronger community relationships. Angie has been training social service professionals nationally since 1998 through the University of Iowa's National Resource Center for Family-Centered Practice. One of our other panelists is Reverend Dr. David R Mack, who was born and raised in the Maryland area. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Behavioral Science at Concordia College, Bronxville, New York, a Master of Divinity degree from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, a Master of Education in Counseling at Eastern Illinois University, and a Doctorate of Ministry degree from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He has served in the Air Force Reserve from 1980 to 1986 while he was a pastor in Hillsborough, Texas. In 1986, he went active duty as a chaplain. Chaplain Maack served as a variety of ministries through his Air Force career. And while serving as a Protestant chaplain at several bases, he also had the opportunity to help mount Pentatube evacuation efforts in Hawaii and several other efforts throughout the years. Some of the other highlights of his ministry to several deployed locations included Jordan, Egypt, Korea, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Italy, Denmark, Spain, and many others. In 2005, Reverend Maack accepted a call to be the executive director of the Lutheran Mission Society Compassion Place in Baltimore, Maryland. The Lutheran Mission Society was established in 1905, is a Christian health and welfare agency with 9 compassion centers throughout Maryland and 1 in York, Pennsylvania. These centers serve over 500 walk-in clinics per day, providing food, clothing, health services, disaster relief, educational services, low-income housing, disaster relief, and professional Christian counseling. During COVID, these centers are providing food to over 1,000 families a week. Pastor Maack's wife, Susan, is presently teaching at St. Paul's Lutheran in Glen Buren, and they have 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. Finally, our last panelist is Tim Kurth, who I have the privilege of serving alongside as one of the vice presidents for the LCEF Ministry Solutions team, focusing specifically on agencies and RSOs of the LCMS. He began his career as a Lutheran grade school teacher and spent over 20 years serving congregations in the Chicago area as a DCE. Along the way, Tim participated in the launch of a Lutheran high school, led short-term mission trips domestically and internationally, and served as development director for 2 different international missions organizations. Joining LCF in 2017, Tim has expanded the Ministry Solutions work with RSOs from capital campaigns into consulting on development and donor relations, board governance, and nonprofit executive leadership. In 2020, Tim became a certified governance systems professional through Govern for Impact. He's a father of 2 and grandfather of 2 living in Whitestown, Indiana. Thank you 3 for joining us. I feel so humble after reading all 3 of your bios. I'm so glad that you could join us today. I'm going to start around the screen here, and we'll start in the order in which I introduced you. If you could just share as executive directors, Angie and David, what does your board look like currently? Speak to maybe some of the terms, and if you have any training that you specifically do with your board today.
So our board, we just redid our bylaws about 3 years ago, and decreased the size of our board a little bit just because recruitment can be a challenge at times. And so we have allows 9 to 15 members. We have 3 active committees from our board as well. We also limit those a little bit to reduce the time commitment that we're asking from people. We have about 4 board meetings a year, sometimes up to 5 based on strategic planning or special projects we're working on, that kind of thing. Term limits, we do 2 terms of 3 years each. Our bylaws do allow for an extra 1 year, and we did that 7th year if there's a specific need and a place that board member fills on the board, and there might be a gap on the board for leadership. But also we did that for continuity. Sometimes you need a former board member or a board member who's been on there for 6 years to stay for that 7th year, maybe to help with leadership and that kind of thing. So that kind of generally sets up what the look of our board is.
Wonderful. David, how about you?
We also have 9 members on our board, but we allow advisory board members over and above that when we do needs, things like that. Originally, our RSO was all Missouri Synod LCMS people, and when I got here 10 years or 16 years ago, I should say, I saw there's got to be a need to change here, and bring outsiders in and make them insiders, actually. And so we do have all Lutheran board members, but it is from Missouri ELCA, NALC, and LCMC, and a wide variety of people are allowed to be on the board. Then I want to talk about this later, I think, because of, Tim's going to probably talk about it. I'm not sure, but term limits, we don't have them, and that's a high and low. And so I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, but they're all on 3-year terms. So.
Great. Do either of you have some sort of onboarding? Could you speak to how you onboard new members to your board?
Mm-hmm. So our governance committee has become a lot more active in the last couple of years. So we are actually beefing up some of our onboarding. But what we do is, I like to think of onboarding or, bringing people along in that orientation is happening over a period of time. So we do give them some information before they start, try to bring them up to speed on kind of how the meetings work. And how, a little bit about our finances and that kind of thing. We really also try to follow up with them after that first board meeting, because so many times they don't know what to ask. There's nothing to attach the information to until they've actually been part of a board meeting. And then so we spend some time with them afterwards. If we have some board members who will be coming on after we've had strategic planning meeting. We're doing some strategic planning this year. And so we're going to have to spend some extra time with them so we can bring them up to speed between the two meetings of, when we bring our consultant in. So it really kind of is based on what the board members need. We really try to give some good financial information and background, as well as kind of that culture of board governance that we have. We really want the board to stay at that strategic governance level. And so we talk a little bit about that, making sure that we kind of reiterate that as we go along. It's okay if they ask questions that are in the weeds, but we really want them at that higher governance level.
Okay, thanks for sharing.
We're pretty much the same way. I sit down with them with my board chair, all the new people, and do a lot of history behind it and instructions. We sit down with the business manager of my organization and the treasurer on a regular basis, and work together with them so they understand the finance side of it. And as well as sometimes we bring in the secretary as well to bring in some of the history behind it as well. And then it's more one-on-one between myself and the board chair and the new people to do some more training.
That is great. So, Tim, we haven't gotten to you. Now that we've heard a little bit from Angie and David, who seem to have similar board styles, could you speak a little bit about the variety of boards that you encounter, especially in your role with LCEF?
Sure. I work with I work with all RSOs and agencies. So everything from Lutherans for Life to Lutheran high schools around the country, camps. And all of them have different board structures. Many of them are patterned after church boards or ministry boards. And one of the things that sort of moved me into this role was seeing how difficult it was for organizations with boards that didn't fully understand their job. And as I got deeper in and heard people talk about governance and policy governance in particular, or the Carver model and different models of governance, I started to look at that as perhaps a resolution to some of the difficulties. And so what I do now with boards, and you mentioned in the intro that was certified as a governance systems professional a couple of years ago now. And so now what I do is really look at how they're governed and what the board thinks their role is within the organization, and then do a lot of education on what the governance models are, and particularly the policy governance model, because I think it's very malleable for almost any organization of any size. And then talk about the roles of the three lanes, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but ownership, governance, and operations, and some clarity there. And so my work initially is just to ask questions, look at what RSOs do in terms of boards and bylaws and governance and policies. And even those that consider themselves a policy board, I'll look and say, you've got policies, but you're not functioning as a policy board or as a Carver model board, and talk through that. So, and then those that are interested, we will work with them to change their board structure, rewrite policies around the model, and better understand the swim lanes, the different lanes.
Yeah, there's a journey for each of those boards, and it looks really different. And both Angie and David, you mentioned that when you began with your organizations, what your board looks like now and what it looks like back then has changed. Angie, I think you even mentioned you've made some recent changes. So could each of you reflect a little bit on maybe the journey of your boards, whether there's been some good and some bad notes along the way that has kind of brought to that makeup now? Each of you have touched a little bit about that, but if you could dig in a little further.
So you referenced, and note to self, my bio was a little long, so I'm going to tweak that.
You're doing some amazing things. That's great.
So anyway, but we referenced 2013 when we did some strategic planning, and it really was a point in time when it kind of redefined some things for our board. And one of the things that we did was and this may seem small, but we had a finance committee on the board, one of our three committees, and we changed it to Finance and Sustainability Committee. Because it was important to change the name because we wanted to change the focus of that committee, which had been pretty fiduciary. They get the financials quarter, they look at those, they look at the budget, all of that stuff goes to the board, but they get the first swipe at that, take care of the audit, make sure they kind of manage that. But we really want, and I said, those are such lag indicators. By the time they get financials, they get financials in the middle of the next quarter, they're already 2-3 months old. And so we want them to look at those, very important, but also be looking ahead. And so it really was important to shift the whole board, but that committee in particular to looking forward. So are we asking questions about the future? And I know, Tim, you've got wording around that and a whole structure of how that works, but great to be looking at the past, but where are we headed? And at that point said to the board, I need your strategic lens. I need you to be thought partners with me. And where does LSSI go in 3 years from now and 5 years from now? Yes, we're looking at next year, but we also have staff looking at next year. So really be looking ahead. So I think that was a shift.
I love that it was something small, but that had a big impact. I think sometimes we think that we have to make big changes to a structure in order to have big results. But I really appreciate just that little nuance of changing that board and changing that focus. That question of looking ahead is so key. And I know Tim is going to talk a little bit about that with our lanes, but I really appreciate that. David, could you talk a little bit about how your board has gone through its transition
Sure.
to where it is today?
It was interesting when I first came on. I heard a couple board members say, "We have a new executive director. We're going to see some change." And that gave me permission to do things. And a couple of the changes, at first I looked at the bylaws and I said, we need to change a few things there. I got here and there was 3 or 4 pastors on my board. I'm going, why? Let's pick lawyers and finance people and business people and all that be on our board. And so we changed a little bit of that in our bylaws. And so now we have more of a variety of people on our board. The one thing I have not changed yet, and I mentioned this earlier, is the term limits. And I'm not sure what that's a plus or a minus. Angela, you said sometimes it's good to have them on. And I agree with that at times. My problem was the person who really believed in term limits were the older people, including the board chair. How do you change? But also, you want to keep certain people that have the history behind it, particularly lawyers, or particularly certain people that need to be on that board for the history. So we haven't changed that yet, but so the way I handle that is I go to people who have been there for a long period of time and said, let's change your role. How about being a mentor? How about being an emeritus and stay around, because I still need your talents and your skills. And so eventually I might be able to change this term limit idea, but like I said, it's a high and a low, and as long as my board members are willing to listen and say, okay, let's move you on to a different role besides a board member, it's working.
Yeah. Now, do each of you have different terms for your chair of the board? We spoke a little bit about that last week with Kurth Sensky, but do either of your organizations have some term limits to that?
Ours tends to be 1 to 2 years.
Okay.
It kind of depends on the way it falls, and board leadership. It's kind of, you're always nuancing this because sometimes people have to leave the board early and that kind of thing, but 1 to 2 years for board chair.
Okay.
And no, I don't. And
Okay.
once again, that was the problem of my chairperson that was in charge. He's my emeritus. He's my advisor. He's my lawyer. So I use him a lot now, but he's not on the board anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is he on that kind of advisory
Yes.
role that you were talking about? Okay.
Yes.
So you were able to use his gifts and talents in that way.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's often a struggle, right? Is just finding the quality of people that you need for your board, not just for maybe their resume, but their gifts and talents that they can use live with that.
Exactly.
So that's can be really hard. So each of you have shared a little bit about your board and the journey. Could you all reflect a little bit on the function? How would you describe the function of your board right now? I don't know who wants to go first on that.
I'm following your rule, ladies first.
Okay, okay. We've kind of started a process here. So,
Yes.
you know, I spoke to strategy and governance, and that's where we try to keep our board focused. We did a strategic plan in 2019, and we're calling this year a reboot, because I would normally not do strategic planning that close together, but a lot has changed in our world. And it's been really good to kind of bring our board along and help update them, so that if we have to make any big decisions at some point, not anticipating anything right now, but as things change and funding streams are shifting, they're up to speed on that. So that's what we're really using right now. So keeping them trying to help them be at that strategic level. Again, they can ask any question that they want and we will answer that. But where we need their thinking is at that governance level and strategy level. And I like what David said about bringing their gifts and talents into that, because I don't need another communications person or another fundraiser as a staff fundraiser, but I need them at that board level. I need them activating their resources, their skills at that higher level. So helping us think a little broader. They can sometimes engage individuals, whether it be fundraising, sponsorships, even expertise. Their reach is so different than for us as a staff. So that's basically, how we utilize them. They've become more active in inviting people to, when I say events, more of a mingle event, not a gala, not a banquet, but engaging some of their friends and their companies that they have contact with. So that's kind of their sweet spot. And I believe that, again, my job is to kind of help them stay in that sweet spot that gives the organization the benefit and the resources that they have.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. David, how about you?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. My board functions very well. They blend well together. They enjoy each other's fellowship, which also is very important, I think. We actually meet once a month, probably about 8 times a year or something like that, over dinner and everything. Well, we try to do over dinner with COVID nowadays, but and that makes a big difference, meeting over dinner, because they have a friendship and a fellowship that works together very well. They are truly a policy-based board, but as Tim probably will say later on, sometimes they like to reach out of their corner, but they do truly care about the ministry and the success of the organization.
Yes. And so you've teed us up for what we've all been waiting for. So Tim, we've been diving into the various things, and all three of us have mentioned kind of the lanes that can happen with board governance. Could you elaborate on that? And especially as you go in and start to educate a board and its leadership team, how do you paint that picture for them? And we've been calling it lanes. So could you explain that a little bit further for us?
Sure, and it's called lanes because of swim lanes. If you've ever swum competitively, which I haven't, but when you see that, if a swimmer wanders out of their lane and they bump into another swimmer, they sort of make a mess of the whole competition. And so when we say lanes, we're talking about swim lanes and staying in your lane. And I want to pick up what Angie said about boards being forward thinking, strategic. We call them aspirational. So they want to have a big picture vision of the future of the ministry, as opposed to doing what I call historical review. Unfortunately, many boards get caught up. So here's what happens. You get invited onto a board. That sounds important. As a member of a board, I must have some significant contribution to make to the organization. But there's not a working model that tells the board what their role really is. So I have to guess at it. And mostly I'm guessing that I should look at last year's budget. I should look at last month's toilet paper order and see if it was right. And, see, so I call it historical review, which really doesn't benefit anybody. And it sort of frustrates the people on the board because they feel like they should be important, but what they're doing doesn't feel important. And then they walk out of the meetings frustrated. So what we try and do is help them understand what a board really exists for. And to do that, you have to understand a little bit of the history. And I'm going to make this very quick. But hundreds of years ago, when we moved out of an agrarian culture into more of an industrial culture, we moved into cities and people started opening shops and having stores, particularly over in England. You've heard of debtor's prison. Well, I put all my money into a shop and the shop didn't work and I had bills to pay and I couldn't pay my creditors. And so they put me in prison for it. So what I did is I would go out and find family members who would each take a share of the business to mitigate financial risk. So none of us would lose everything if the business went down and we'd be protected. And then the family would get together and make decisions about the business and then operate the business. Well, then somebody got the bright idea, what if we invite everybody, as many people as want to invest? So now we have shareholders. So now I can't get 100 people in a room to make operational decisions and be the owners and also run things. So what do? Well, I'll set up a board. Oh, great. So that's a group of people who have the best interests of the owners at heart and oversee operational excellence. So that's how the 3 swim lanes developed. So now, fast forward to today, boards often don't function much different than they did 100 years ago, except that they don't understand their role. And the role of a board is to represent the best interests of the owners and oversee operations. Legally, a board has fiduciary responsibility for a ministry or for any organization. So the board is held accountable by the state and by everybody else for the organization. That board, that's why boards have liability coverage and insurance coverage and all that, because they are the entity responsible for the organization. They're responsible to the owners for doing what the owners want the organization to do, and they're responsible to the CEO to oversee the operations side. Now they delegate the operations side to the CEO, who then has full responsibility for all staffing and hiring and budgeting and all the operational stuff. So now you've got your 3 swim lanes established. So focus on the board swim lane. The board then has a responsibility to regularly check in with owners. And this is where boards miss a lot. Now it's easy in a school because a school has 8, 10, 12 association churches that are legally the owners, but we've got to reach beyond that. We've got to think about the owners as the moral owners. In policy governance, we talk about moral owners. Now, not all constituents are owners, but all owners are constituents. So you've got to really think deeply as a board, who has an ownership interest in our organization doing well and existing? And then how do we connect with them on a once or twice a year basis to see that we're meeting their needs, that we're serving their interests, and that what we're doing is accomplishing the whole reason they own us, right? And that's a piece that a lot of boards miss. They don't do that ownership, what we call ownership linkage, with any intentionality. They don't do an annual survey. They don't do focus groups. They don't do town halls with owners to find out if what you're doing is meeting the owner's needs for you existing, right? And then the board takes all of the authority that they have for the ministry, which is 100% of the authority, and they say, okay, the operational authority, we're going to delegate. We're going to hire a CEO and delegate our operational authority. And then that person will, and so that drives the different kinds of policies. So there's 4 kinds of policy and policy governance, right? It's how you talk to yourself as a board, how the CEO, how you limit the CEO's playing field for what they can do operationally, how that CEO reports back to you, and how you link with owners. So you talk about policies, and there's a lot of nuances under that. But those are the 3 swim lanes. That's the history, and I'll stop now. A very quick that's essentially how it plays out. And I'll say once a board understands that their role is aspirational and vision casting, and that they are to talk to owners about what the owners want and delegate to the CEO operational stuff, and then hear back from the CEO, that it's called monitoring reporting, that everything they expect to be happening is happening, then the board can spend a lot of time talking about policy. And so we always say in policy governance, the primary product of a board is talking. There should be talking about, have we said enough in policy? If we've said too much, we rescind. If we haven't said enough, we write new policies. There should be a policy conversation at every single board meeting You should always be reviewing and making sure you've said everything that you should say and want to say. So there's a lot more we could say, but
I was going to say, this is clearly something you enjoy doing, Tim, as you share your passion.
I nerd out on this stuff. I started reading leadership books and textbooks, and I was telling friends how exciting I was, and they're like, "You're not right. There's something wrong there."
Well, we need people like you. I mean, I think between you and Kurth last week, I mean, there's a clear need for it, and we appreciate that there are these resources available for people. So I'm going to put Angie and David on the spot, reflecting on what Tim just shared and you shared with us about your board. How do you feel about the function of your board and maybe the ownership that you have as the CEO or executive director, and those 2 lanes or 3 lanes, and maybe if you have an example of where what some has crossed, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Well, I think, so it is good when a board operates according to these lanes. And I think that having a consultant like Tim come in and frame that up for a board, or even get a board back on track. So I think there's and Tim can probably speak to this, there's sometimes a drift that boards can have over time, especially if, leadership of that board takes it in a different direction. So I kind of see part of my role is kind of helping boards stay at those levels and stay in their lanes. I meet pretty regularly with my board chair. And I usually at some points of that time, probably about half the time, we bring the vice chair in because they're getting ready to be board chair next. And using them in a way that helps kind of the board stay on track. I'm kind of setting out here's some priorities, here are some things that the board needs to be discussing, and then they kind of help to steer that. And I think that's important, because I think we've all seen boards get off track, and then that takes a lot of exec time to help get them back on track, or to start addressing the things that they get distracted with. So I think, and I think one of the ways, I can't think of a specific example of where we've gotten off track, but just sometimes there's little times when, we want them, for one thing, they do kind of a review of our 401k, of our benefits, some of those kind of things, kind of that risk management piece that our finance committee does. And sometimes they get back down into the weeds. And I say that they get into the weeds because that's something we all understand. Like, have you tried to get a cheaper car insurance? Or what are you spending on cell phone bills? And we have 77 employees. So, but it's okay for them to ask that. But I think it's kind of our job then as execs to bring them back up. And here's where we really need your eye. Yeah. So,
No, that's great. And I think what I appreciate, Angie, is and something that I would encourage too, as an executive director, when you see that, is to be empowered to speak that. So sometimes, we'll encounter, and Tim can speak to this too, where an executive director recognizes that a board has gone adrift, to use your language there, but isn't quite sure how to say it, or maybe even too timid to say it. But they need to help with that because they see that bigger vision and can help drift that back. But Tim is also an awesome resource. But David, I want to allow you an opportunity as well to speak about how your board has stayed in its lane or not.
I think also ours stays in the lane, but it's kind of hard to stay in your lane when you were an owner at first, or a donor, or however you are. And then all of a sudden you became a governing or a board member, and they like to go back into the ownership every so often. And more importantly, they like to go back to the operational and tell you what, maybe you should try this, maybe you should try that. We're actually doing 2 remodel jobs in 2 of our buildings right now. One because someone decided to make a drive-through at one of our buildings and drove right through the center of the place. But the other one, but they're saying, well, maybe you got to do carpet, maybe you got to do tile, maybe you got to, and I say, thanks for your input, I'll look into it. And that's how I get out of it a lot of times. I'd be very polite with them. I'll look into it. And then usually they change subjects then.
Yeah.
But I let them sometimes discuss for a couple minutes and then try to move them back into the agenda of what we really need to be doing as a board. But they like to put their 2 cents in all the time.
I would say they always like to put their 2 cents in, right? Their gifts and talents, we want them to use it, but to use it in the right way. So those can get muddied. And especially with your board, it looks like a lot of its board members have history there, which adds another lens that can make it even muddier. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. And I think there's people who are listening to this who will understand exactly what you mean with that.
Hope my board members aren't listening. No.
They're doing a great job, and we all need
they
guidance,
are.
right?
They-
That's the reality. And
I really love my board.
yeah, and we need to constantly be checked. I think Angie said that, being able to get together and review and make sure that we're all doing what we need to do. It's all about checks and balances and having that accountability. So Tim, as you've gone out and worked with various RSOs and associations, I'm looking at our time and I want to leave some time. If anybody has questions, you can drop it in the chat feature right now. But Tim, could you share maybe what are the top 2 or 3 ways that, and I think you said a little bit of this, that when you start with a board to figure out what's their journey to be in a healthier place, how do you tackle that as you go in and work with various organizations?
Well, it's simple, but it's really, really hard because it's changing people's mindset, and changing a mindset and an entrenched way of feeling, thinking, doing is hard. So it's the simple part is identifying what's an operational discipline and what's a governance discipline. And then saying the board doesn't involve itself in operational disciplines. You delegate that. And so when you get into a board meeting and someone wants to talk about, getting better car insurance rates or reviewing the staff handbook, those are operational topics. You're not going to talk about that, right? You're not going to discuss operational things at the board level. You've delegated that. So that's the first thing. And then to go to Angie's point about how does the CEO interact with the chairman, or what we call the chief governance officer? Well, there's 2 simple rules in policy governance that drive that. One is the board speaks with one voice. So no individual board member can speak with any authority as if by the board to anybody, to a staff member, to the CEO, to anybody. And second of all, the board only speaks in writing. So if something comes up in a board meeting and there's a conflict with the CEO simply says, can you show me where that's in writing in policy? And if they can't, then it can't be discussed because the board hasn't spoken. And if the board wants to speak, they have to go back into session and write a policy that speaks to that and get all of the board to agree to that, or a majority of the board to agree to that. Also, you have something called reasonable interpretation. It's a conversation. The board chair or the CEO goes to the board and says, I've read your policies, and by my reasonable interpretation, I'm allowed to do these things operationally. And if the board goes, oh, we didn't mean to give you permission to do that, they go, well, let us go back and revise those policies. But if everybody says, yep, that's a reasonable interpretation, then you go and do that. And then, so if it's not in writing, the board hasn't spoken, and the board only speaks with one voice. If you hold to those understandings, it makes communication so much more clear.
I mean, the communication is such an important part to any organization in all facets. So I really appreciate, Tim, you saying that. And I know both Angie and David would agree. And so being able to speak the same language is really where I'm hearing from you is the biggest step, is to all say, we're agreeing to this particular language and verbiage and make sure everyone understands what it means. And, we throw out the words board governance, and it could mean something different to every single individual in a room. And so being able to make that nice and clear for everybody is really, really important, and an easy yet complicated place to start. So thank you for sharing that. I'm looking at our time, and we're going to get ready to to wrap up. So I'm going to have each of our panelists think about one piece of advice that they'd like to give out. And while they're doing that, I want to give anybody a chance to drop into the chat any questions or comments they'd like to share while we listen to a word from LCEF.
Hello, everyone. My name is Blake Brown, Assistant Vice President of National Lending Solutions at the Lutheran Church Extension Fund.
And my name is Dan Brown, Vice President of National Lending Solutions at Lutheran Church Extension Fund.
On behalf of our organization, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. LCEF is thankful for the opportunity to partner with the LCMS RSO office and provide this resource to all of you. We pray that it's a blessing to you and the work that you're doing through your organization. LCEF has been exceptionally busy over the past year as we work to support the ministries of many RSOs, congregations, and schools such as yours. We know that there have been many unique challenges over the past several years, and in the midst of it all, God is good. We want you to know that we're here to support you any way we can.
We are here to support you through low-cost loans, credit lines, or other opportunities for growth in your ministry. We work with both large and small ministries across the U.S. As part of the LCMS for over 40 years, we understand you like no other lender. We invite you to reach out by email or phone. We would love to connect with you about your ministry and see how LCEF can support. You will receive a follow-up email after the webinar, and our contact information will be included.
Again, thank you for watching this webinar, and we continue to pray for you and your ministry. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Again, we are so excited to have our panelists today about board governance and just kind of the practicality of it. Before I ask our panelists for their final piece of advice, we did have a couple of questions come through, and I wanted to start with asking, I think any of you, so I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, whoever wants to answer, about board membership. So it's two questions. The first is, what are your thoughts on having family on the board? And along the same line, as a CEO or an executive director, should you recommend names for the board?
So I don't know if you're talking about my family members or two family members on the board. My answer to both is no.
Yeah, I think it means both, whether it's your own
Yeah.
family member or having a husband and wife on the board.
I also have told a board member who submitted the name of her husband to be employed by our organization. I told her, I said, and she hadn't been on the board very long. I said, well, if we hire him, you'll have to go off the board. So do you still want him to be a candidate? Yeah, so.
That's great.
Anyway, that's
I agree
fine.
with that. I agree with that.
As I say, is there anybody who feels differently about that? I didn't think so. Okay. All right.
The thing about
go ahead.
us providing names, I think we are part of the brainstorming. And I think it has to be you contributing to that.
Mhm.
Yes, I would agree.
Names as well as qualifications. You know, you might not know who a person might be, but I need this, this, and this in a person.
Absolutely.
I think that is very key to know what you need. Again, those gifts and talents is really important. So great. Steve Shave said this, Tim, you might reflect on this. Steve works with Lamp Ministry, and he has members to give ownership to our stake holders or supporters. And so they host a meeting every year and give them the link that you had talked about. So he just wanted to share that that's what they're doing with theirs. So Tim, have you worked with Lamp Ministry?
I haven't worked with LAMP, very familiar with their good work, but I haven't worked with them directly, no. But that's a great idea. That's one model, is to Zoom people in or have a board meeting or have a conference, but invite the owners to speak to the ministry and if it's serving their needs.
Yeah, And Tim, I'm going to toss this to you as well. John asks, could you discuss the role of a governance subcommittee? And I
Sure.
think, Angie, you have a little bit of this as well, too, if you want to jump in.
Yeah. So there's and in a policy governance setting, there's very few committees, because again, you ask the question, is this operational or governance? And you may have a finance committee, but they're not there to write the budgets. They're there to oversee the annual audit and other monitoring type things. A governance subcommittee would be looking at the governance function of the board. Are we staying on track? Perhaps a review of policies, recommendations to the board about what policies need to be refreshed or removed, and onboarding, how to onboard a member so that they're fully up to speed to what the governance model is, the policy governance model. And also the annual retreat for the board on what their agenda is, who they would bring in as a consultant to teach more about the governance model, because you constantly have to be educating people, or they will slip back into old models of sticking their fingers into operations and getting out of their lane. So that it's a constant vigilance, and the governance subcommittee can help keep the board on track in that way.
Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
Our
Okay, so
governance
go ahead.
committee is also involved, and we did a board assessment about skills, so we could determine what skill sets are needed on the board, what kind of holes we have as far as, talent and expertise, and also leadership. So they've really done a nice job and stepped to the plate the last couple of years about helping to keep that conversation in front of our board members about recruitment. And we're really recruiting. Part of what our recruitment eye needs to be is who's our next chair going to be in 5 years from now. Not just recruiting for immediate skill sets, but future leadership.
That's great. Well, Angie, while you are talking, I'm going to start with you as we wrap up. What is one piece of advice, especially as a CEO, that you would want to share regarding board governance based off of our conversation today?
This may sound like a canned answer, but really what I found is developing relationships with my board members, especially those that are going to be on the executive committee, staying connected to them. And and I'm not going to say you have to get together with them monthly or anything like that, but kind of because you help them kind of set the vision. Even though they set the vision, it's this relationship where they're your bosses, but you're kind of guiding them. So I think staying connected, and that's why I've really made a point in the last few years here to have regular contact with my board chair and vice chair. Because they don't know what we need unless we say it. They can't just pick up on that from a few board meetings.
So do you meet yearly with your board as a retreat, for instance?
We do have retreats.
Okay.
It's usually 1 or 2 a year. And when I say retreat, I'm talking we extend the board meeting to a 4-hour meeting, and we do the meal. As David said, them eating together and having mingle time has been huge in developing that community.
Yeah, the question was asked, is there value in doing a retreat? And I think we would all agree that there is value in that, correct?
Crucial.
Yeah. And I'm going to take, I know we still have 2 more pieces of advice, but I want to take this last question here. And Angie, I think you might speak to this the most. Could you talk about the role of a finance committee and the danger of that committee getting involved on the operational side?
That was for Angie.
I think so. I mean, anybody could answer it if anybody wants to.
I'm sorry, my connection's unstable, so I apologize.
Oh,
Did you
no,
intend
that's
that? You said for me.
Yeah.
If you want to answer it, sure.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I was going to say too, with kind of input here, is the financials you show your board. They can see anything that they have a right to see anything that you have, but the financials we give them are higher level financials. So if you give your finance committee the financials your accountant or your CFO is looking at, And that level of detail, and I'm talking about, every line, they're going to dig down into those lines. So I think giving your board the information you want them to focus on. And when I say that, I'm not saying you hold information back from them, but what is that information you want them to focus on and at what level? So I don't know, David and Tim probably have some better ways of saying
Yeah,
that.
either of you want to add
Well,
any
we do the
additional
same thing.
comments?
We have a small finance committee too, and basically all they do is they take every line item and make sure there's no errors. Because when you work with Excel or anything else, you're going to find an error here and error there. And you find that the guys who knows the math a lot better and the Excel sheets a whole lot better, and they go through it every time. And every year they find at least one mistake, if not a couple, that we missed the addition, or we missed that, or I should say my business office. and we really respect that. We like that. Very few times they say, hey, you need to do this or that. It's more like, let's make sure we got everything up to par.
That's great. So David, while you just ended for us, what is your one piece of advice that you would share as an executive director?
I wish I was before Angie this time, because I have relationships.
Yeah.
Time
The
to get,
redundancy just shows how
Yeah.
important it is.
I mean, I go one-on-one lunchtime or breakfast time with these people and just get to know them personally. And so they know how I think and I know how they think. Even fellowship things, if you have to go out and play golf with them or something, whatever. It's time together to get to know each other one-on-one.
Yeah, that's great. And Tim, we'll save you for last. What's
Yeah.
your piece of advice?
So I'm not going to do advice. I'm going to do an assignment. I want everybody
Okay.
who's listening to this webinar to go back over your last 3 board meeting minutes and discover how much time you spent discussing operational details of the organization and how much time you spent discussing governance and aspirational, forward-looking strategic thinking, and then determine if that's how you want to be investing your time. And because it expresses distrust, whether you mean to or not, it expresses distrust in your CEO if you spend most of your time analyzing operational details.
Mm-hmm.
So go over your last 3 board meeting minutes, and be honest with yourself. How much time did you invest in operational historical review and nitpicking, frankly? And how much time did you spend in policy, aspirational, forward-looking, and strategic thinking? And then call me.
That's great. I love it. No, I love that challenge. And really everyone that is listening to this, whether they're listening to it now or later on, it is really important that we're utilizing the best that we can out of our board. And I know all of us on this webinar would agree, and our listeners. And so I appreciate that challenge. And I'll remind people that Tim is an employee here at LCEF and a resource to all of you. So when you get your follow-up email, you'll actually have the contact for National Lending, who you heard from earlier, and you can reach out to them and they'll connect you with Tim, or reach out to Tim directly through lcef.org. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This has been a great series as we touch the surface, really, of board governance. We pray that it's just been a blessing to you to know that whether your board is healthy or struggling, there are many other people in this boat, and it's a continuous conversation. So I thank Angie and David and Tim for joining me today in this conversation. And reminder that this is being recorded, so you'll receive this later on. If you have any questions or any ways that LCF can support you, please reach out to us. And I echo the same thing for Dorothy, to reach out with her with the RSO office over at the LCMS. On behalf of both of us, thank you again so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.